Hello everyone, good morning. For those of you who don't recognise me, I'm not surprised. I'm the founder of the Fair Fuel UK campaign that stopped £200 billion worth of fuel duty rises. But more importantly, I'm now the Reform UK's London mayoral candidate. And I'm standing for a simple reason, that we've got a dishonest mayor that is ruining London, economically and socially. And I'm going to be banning or scrapping all of ULEZ, all of low traffic neighbourhoods and 20-mile-an-hour zones. And that's just for starters. But I'm very honoured and very proud to be standing here today to introduce Richard Tice, who's going to be talking about really what's happening to our economy today, and there is a solution. We don't have to let it stagnate. So will you put your hands together and welcome Richard Tice.
Thank you, Howard, and a very good morning to everybody. It's great to see you here. Now, in early August, you might think, indeed, it's a strange time to be talking about icebergs. But it has, of course, been a pretty gloomy, cold, rainy July here in the UK. And the truth is that we've got some serious challenges ahead for the UK economy. And that's why the title of today's press conference is Iceberg Ahead, Change Course or Sink. Just over a year ago, we put forward an emergency recovery plan, talking about what needed to be done so that we could grow our way out of the economic crisis the country faced. We warned of low growth, of weak productivity, of high taxes, high government spending, and the sustained inflation threat. And we put forward the clear solutions. But the government, they ignored us. Instead, they actually doubled down on the mistakes that they are making. They've increased taxes yet further, and they've increased spending yet further. And we can see where we are today. We are teetering. We are completely flatlining. We're heading towards recession. Now, the Office for Budget Responsibility, they put out a warning recently that hasn't been properly picked up about an emerging national debt crisis in the UK. We think they're woefully complacent on the timing of the risk of this. They're talking about a decade or so ahead. If we don't change course, we are heading towards a national debt crisis in a matter of just a few years' time. And we'll come on to show that later in the presentation. So the government needs to urgently change course. If it doesn't adopt the sort of growth strategy that we put forward, instead of their failed model of tax, spend and regulate, then we are facing a debt crisis, stagflation, and I'm afraid to say that then leads to a complete currency collapse. Now, I've talked before about Rishi's socialist solution, and that's what it is. It's the classic failed measures of socialism. Raising personal taxes, raising corporate taxes, which disincentivises investment. Raising government spending. There's no such thing, folks, as government money. It's your money. It's everybody here's money. It's our money. It's taxpayers' cash. It's unbelievable how much waste there is in the system. Do you remember Boris Johnson promising to reduce the number of civil servants by 90,000? Only this week we discover, instead of reducing them, the numbers yet again have gone up. And what this does, it creates a culture of subsidy, of dependency. And that is fatal for the economy. The result of all of these failed socialist solutions, and I use that word really, really importantly. Socialism is what we've got from the main two parties. You've got the con-socialist Tories, and then you've got the Socialist Labour Party. Two sides of the same socialist coin. And the result? Lower growth or no growth. And a complete disincentive to make work pay. We've got almost 9 million people in this country, 9 million adults, economically inactive, including over 5 million on out-of-work benefits. We've got to grow our way out of a crisis. And our growth plan is absolutely clear. First of all, we've got to cut the huge amount, the vast amount of wasteful government spending. It's everywhere. All of us at home, we're looking at our budgets. There's a serious cost of living crisis, and we're saying, right, how do we save, for example, £5 in 100, but still pay the bills? £5 in 100. So just imagine if every public sector manager of every department, every spending department, every quango, every local authority, if they're told, you've also got to save £5 in 100, £5 in 100, without cutting any frontline services, rather like we do at home. Yes, the nice to haves, you put those to one side, but you still provide and pay for the essentials. If every public sector manager did that, and if not, frankly, you do the same as what happens in business. You're told what to do, you deliver it, or you're fired. Guess what? They'll save £5 in 100. All of a sudden, you're talking about some quite serious cash. In fact, on the vast amounts of government spending, saving £5 in 100 is 60 billion quid. 60 billion pounds a year could be saved. Must be saved. We've got to get Britain working again. 5.2 million people, adults. That's 1 in 8 of the working age population. For every million of those we get back into work, that's 15 billion quid, give or take, every single year, as well as hugely improving their achievement, their sense of self-worth, sense of dignity, contribution to their community and the economy. And of course, if we get our own people back into work, then you reduce the huge, insatiable demand from big business and from politicians that we need to import more cheap, low-skilled labour. We don't. We've just got to look after our own people. We've got to motivate and incentivise our own people back into work. There's another thing that's utterly extraordinary. The Bank of England is paying interest on the vast amount of money that it printed, 850 billion of quantitative easing. Voluntarily, it doesn't need to. It's paying interest on that money. And of course, as every time the Bank of England raises interest rates, guess what? That bill goes up and up. It's now 30 to 40 billion quid a year. The European Central Bank isn't doing this. The Bank of Japan isn't doing this. Why on earth are we doing it? I've said it before. I'll say it again. You're literally impoverishing the British taxpayer to enrich city institutions. So if the Bank of England does raise rates today as is forecast, in an hour's time, which it should not do, by the way, completely the wrong strategy, but no surprise that once again the Bank of England are getting it wrong. If they raise rates further, this voluntary bill goes up again. Why are we voluntarily enriching city institutions 30 to 40 billion quid a year? Oh, and by the way, a one-off 50 billion if you want to save. We could scrap the useless HS2 that even the Infrastructure and Projects Authority just last week, has said the delivery of that is unachievable. We all know that it's a massive, massive white elephant. There are tens and tens of billions that can be saved every single year. Just these items alone that I've mentioned, it's 100 billion plus every year. This is serious money. It's your money. It's our money. And we shouldn't be wasting it. Instead, what we should be doing, and this is the other key element of our growth plan, is we should be cutting consumer taxes, reducing taxes to stimulate and activate growth. And Ben Habib is going to talk in a second about why growth is so essential. It's so important to get our economy going again. I've used this slogan before, but I'll say it again. We've got to make work pay. And the way to do that is to free up 6 million of the lowest paid from paying any income tax whatsoever. Now, YouGov just did a poll just the other day on this specific policy of Reform UK's, over 75% of people said, yes, this is the right economic strategy. So you lift the starting point at which you pay any income tax whatsoever from 12.5 grand to 20,000 quid. Every week, that's £30 net in your pocket to help pay bills. What's the government doing? It's doing the opposite. It's dragging in millions of more of the lowest paid in our country into paying income tax. It's morally indefensible, it's economically indefensible, and it's frankly an outrage. The truth is, we haven't got a labour shortage here. We haven't got a people shortage in the UK. We've got a willing worker shortage because for too many people, work doesn't pay. This fundamental policy, make works pay, and will immediately attract many, many hundreds of thousands off out of work benefits back into work. And that reduces the pressure on immigration. We can also use this saving by cutting wasteful government spending so that you can scrap VAT on energy bills that the government's promised to do before. It's a great Brexit opportunity, once again, that's been wasted by this useless Tory government. We should scrap the unnecessary environmental levies. These are hundreds of pounds every single year for households, ordinary folk struggling with the cost of living crisis. If we do this, we can help everybody. We should reduce fuel duty by 20 pence per litre. Again, saving people, every driver, almost 300 quid a year. Howard Cox, who kindly introduced me this morning, he saved motorists across the country tens of billions of pounds over the last 10 years or so. This creates economic activity. We can reduce VAT from 20% to 18%. Saving hundreds of pounds per household per year. This is real cash, folks. It's your cash that currently the government is wasting. And of course, we've got to reduce corporation tax back down from 25% that the socialist Sunak introduced, back to 19%. You've got to stimulate investment. There's got to be a reason to invest, to attract money into this country, to invest in risk-taking, in taking jobs. And then net zero is, of course, very much at the top of the news. Now listen, we all want to save the environment. We all want cleaner air. But let's do it in a pragmatic, affordable, proportionate way. And that means scrapping the completely arbitrary temperature, the arbitrary deadline of net zero. I've declared, and I'll say it again, I think we are now at peak net zero. We're now allowed to have this debate, and we will be at the forefront of it. And if we do these measures, then all of a sudden we will stimulate real significant growth. Every single year, we estimate it'll be at least 0.5% higher growth. That's real money. That creates more tax revenues. And crucially, our measures to reduce taxes mathematically in the first year would reduce inflation by around about 4%. This is serious. This is the way to stimulate our economy. And I'm now going to ask Ben Habib to come and just talk about why growth is so important and some of the other factors that is holding this great nation of ours back. Ben, over to you.
Thank you very much, Richard. What a brilliant exposition of how we got to where we are. And this graph, I think, sort of sums it up, doesn't it? If you look at UK growth rates over the last few decades, when we've had our highest borrowing and our highest taxation rates, we've had the lowest growth. And it's something that all Conservatives should understand. The problem with socialism is that you eventually run out of other people's money. And that is effectively where we have now got with our economy, and it's evidenced in these growth rates for UK GDP. If you were to translate those, that's in sterling, by the way, if you were to translate those into dollars, you'd see a shrinking GDP, because in real terms, the currency crisis that Richard forecast we're going to have is already partially on us. The way we've bolstered the meagre growth that we've had is at the expense of sterling. And as we get progressively worse economically, we will see sterling go down even further. In contrast, if you look at US growth over the same periods, you'll see a completely different picture. They've had much lower taxes. They've championed their production of domestic fossil fuels. They've powered their economy ahead, and GDP in dollar terms has gone up dramatically, and in dollars per capita, it's gone up further. Their productivity is up. We are practicing, as Richard said, a form of extreme socialism in the United Kingdom. And instead of learning the lessons of the last decade in borrowing, taxing, and spending, Rishi Sunak seems to think more of the same will get us out of the problem. It should be self-evident that it won't. The notion that the government can tax us, take our money, and spend it more wisely than we would is a lie, ladies and gentlemen. We know the government is no good at government spending because they waste it all. I think it was Rishi Sunak's peer in the House of Lords, Lord Ashurst, if I haven't got his name wrong, who was in charge of government wastefulness, who resigned over the fact that Rishi Sunak, as Chancellor, had wasted so much money during lockdowns. No, we need growth more than anything. If you get growth in the economy, you get general prosperity, wages go up, people want to invest in the United Kingdom, sterling automatically strengthens, and you create a positive cycle out of the downward loop which we now find ourselves in. We've got to find a way to push that cycle back up. And I'm going to digress a bit, but into a really important part of how our economic growth is being undermined, not in this case by taxes, but by regulations, and yes, ladies and gentlemen, the culture war. It's very easy to see the various government policies that we have to live under in silos. We think of immigration in a silo. We think of the attack on our national values in a silo, attack on the British Empire in a silo, attack on our national heroes in a different silo. But actually, they're all part of the same battle. They're all interwoven. And the impact of the attack on British values, culture, history, heritage, our national heroes, has been inculcated, embedded in business through something called environmental, social, and corporate governance policies. We've begun to see how pernicious this is with the revelation that Coutts cancelled Nigel Farage's bank account. It's the first time I've seen the debate on ESG come into the public domain. But I'm going to focus a bit on ESG, if I may, because it's the heart of the problems that the private sector face. Now, it won't surprise people to know that the principal architect, the man who set ESG going into the private sector, was none other than Tony Blair. He couldn't nationalise everything to give effect to his ideological vision for the United Kingdom, so he took a much cleverer route. He embedded it in our private sector, and he did that initially using Section 172 of the Companies Act 2006. I recommend people look it up. For the first time, he made directors in this country responsible not just for their shareholders, their employees, and the taxman and their creditors, which are fundamentally important yardsticks by which Anglo-Saxon capitalism has moved forward, but he made directors responsible to broader stakeholders, including the environment, and that's the mechanism that's now been used to drive net zero through the corporate world, and for social justice. No longer are companies just out there to make money. They're out there to deliver what they view as social justice. And it was this vision of social justice at Coutts that allowed them to believe that Nigel is a bad man, to conclude that Nigel is a bad man because Nigel didn't agree with Coutts's view of diversity and inclusion, to which I'm going to come back. And they cancelled Nigel. And they cancelled his bank account. So what they did In the pursuit of a non-monetary goal, they cancelled a perfectly viable economic contributor to Coutts's bottom line. And that, in a nutshell, ladies and gentlemen, is how the economy is being hijacked by the culture wars. They're taking ideological positions and frustrating profitability in the pursuit of that ideology. We have to ditch ESG. I'm going to come back to diversity and inclusion for a second. So the vast majority of companies, public bodies and other entities in this country have championed their obligation to social justice, an obligation which I think itself should be cancelled, but they've promoted diversity and inclusion as their mechanism for delivering social justice. What is diversity and inclusion? Diversity and inclusion is the promotion of minority ethnicities, minority sexual preferences, minority gender identification, minority basically any minority right or interest you can get hold of and promote that. That effectively has now been adopted as diversity and inclusion. But of course, when you think of it in that way, you might be forgiven prima facie to think, well, that sounds good, you know, you're promoting all these minorities. But what you do when you promote a minority is you demote the majority. And it is economically damaging reverse racism. That's what the vast majority of UK PLC is now practicing. Reverse racism and damaging the economy in the process. This is what Nigel Farage was fighting at Coutts. This is what we're all fighting now in our daily lives. I run a regulated business, First Property Group PLC, which is regulated by the Financial Conduct Authority. So we have to have an ESG policy. We have to report on ESG. And when I first came out about ESG after Nigel blew the lid on it, my son texted me and he said, Daddy, you better just check your ESG policy in case anything you said publicly contravenes what you've said in your policies. And I was really pleased to see that my company, when we came to interpret social justice, the way we deliver it, though I reiterate we shouldn't be obliged to be delivering any form of social justice, but the way we did it was to say everyone is equal, no matter what your ethnicity, no matter what your sexual preference is, no matter how you view net zero, everyone is equal. And that is how it should be done if it's going to be done at all. But we have the worst form of it in the UK at the moment. We are practicing economic damaging policies in the pursuit of this peculiar ideology that is in itself fundamentally racist and prejudiced. It's got to stop. I want to talk a bit about net zero. The US has had this fantastic growth rate that I mentioned. The way it's addressed what Biden describes as the climate crisis is first to become completely fossil fuel independent. It's fracked its way to energy independence. The US used to be one of the biggest importers of fossil fuels. It's now a net exporter of fossil fuels. On the back of that, with the strength that that afforded the US, it has announced the biggest climate crisis fighting package in the world, a $370 billion inflation reduction scheme. It can do that with confidence because it's got a growing economy, because it's energy independent. What we've done in this country is the exact opposite. And again, it comes back to ESG, this drive to net zero. We've adopted the drive to net zero. We've turned our back on our own domestically available fossil fuels. And we've championed renewables when renewables aren't cost effectively available. Another massive burden on the UK economy. In March 2021, Boris Johnson signed something called the North Sea Transition Deal. Many people may not be familiar with that, but the North Sea Transition Deal effectively requires fossil fuel companies to turn their backs on what they have in the North Sea and to go for offshore wind farms, onshore wind farms, notionally creating jobs through renewables, but it isn't going to work. We need fossil fuels, we need them domestically, and instead of getting them domestically, what we're now doing is paying over the odds to get them from the United States of America and from Norway, where they've been sensible enough to understand what their objectives are. So we've got to get off this bandwagon of ideology in business. It's that same ideology that Lawrence Fox at Reclaim is famous for fighting, but it's infecting us economically. Don't think that these battles happen independently. And I'm going to touch just briefly on immigration before I finish. Richard talked about immigration. Immigration has also been delivered to us as a kind of panacea by successive governments, starting with Tony Blair, that those jobs the British aren't prepared or willing to do, immigrants will do. That those jobs that the Brits would charge a lot more money to do, immigrants will do more cheaply. And immigration is being used through ESG and other policy initiatives as a kind of a sort of ideological pure aim. You know, we should be welcoming immigrants. I think it was Lush, the soap company, came out the other day saying we welcome all immigrants, no matter how they get here, even if they cross the channel illegally to come in. We've somehow adopted that hook, line and sinker. But how racist is it to say that the Brits aren't prepared to do a certain kind of work, so we're going to import labour from abroad to do it? That is racism. How lamentable is it to say that we need young people from abroad? We're going to go around the world and hoover up all these people that have been well educated in India, Pakistan and other places. We're going to hoover them up, bring them to the UK for our own purposes because we've got an ageing population which doesn't work. What a lamentable economic policy that is. The idea that our old age pensioners need these youth to come in at cheap costs, undermining our own labour market to look after them. But I've got some news for Sunak. Immigrants also get old. The idea that they're going to be a continuing contributor to the economy is a fundamentally flawed one. They also add inflation into our system. We took in 500,000 immigrants last year, 600,000 this year, in the year that's just ended. That's 1.1 million people. You don't think that creates inflation in costs for housing, NHS, infrastructure, and every other public sector that we know currently isn't working? We've got a failed economic policy driven government. They're socialists, fundamentally socialists. And I'm just going to wrap up by reiterating that eventually the problem with socialism is that you run out of other people's money. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ben. And that's the key point. There are so many factors that impact on our woeful, woeful growth. You can't tax our way out of this crisis. We've got to grow our way out of a crisis. And Ben quite rightly highlighted some of those other factors and talked about silos. You've got to look at all of this. The net result is, what are our forecasts? How does it look going forwards? And this is where the Office for Budget Responsibility, that so many people think are brilliant and we should listen to their every single word. Well, let's just look at their forecasts over the next few years, shall we? And it's on the screen and on the slides here. For the next 3 years, after this year, the Office for Budget Responsibility is forecasting that inflation, currently at 7.9%, will be below 1% every single year. That's never happened for 3 years on the trot. Not in living memory. It's never happened, and yet they think it's going to happen for the next 3 years. If you look at our forecasts, we think it'll reduce to 4.5%, 3.5%, and if we're lucky, we get back to 2% inflation. This is serious, because higher inflation means, of course, higher government spending. It means higher interest rates. It's a vicious circle. So all of their forecasts are on the basis you're going to get down to below 1% for 3 years on the trot. That is woefully, woefully unrealistic. And then let's look at their growth forecast. Well, so they're assuming that inflation will go all the way down, and then that we will grow at 1.8%, 2.5%, 2.1%. That would be nice. But given that our taxes, the government spending now is 47% of the whole of our economy, a third higher than it was 20 years ago. Again, woefully optimistic. If you look at our forecasts, given that we're flatlining at best at the moment and heading south, we're forecasting a recession over the next 12 to 18 months. And then a gradual return to growth. 0.8%, 1.3, 1.5. We think that the OBR is being woefully optimistic on inflation and woefully optimistic on growth. And if we're right, the impact of that on the government finances is really serious. And don't just take our word for it. Look at the IMF. They're forecasting next year 1% growth compared to 1.8% from the OBR. KPMG, just over 1%. The CEBR, they agree with us on inflation levels. The impact is dramatic. And that's why I say iceberg ahead unless we change course. Because if we're right, we're heading towards a serious debt crisis. Not in a decade or so, but in the next few years. With the OBR numbers, they think that our deficit will be 60, 70 billion quid over the next couple of years. If we're right, forget that, scrap that, you're looking at £250 billion every single year. 250 billion quid. These are massive numbers. There would be a crisis in the bond markets. So the OBR is forecasting that debt to GDP, the size of our economy, would flatline or reduce. No. If we're right, then our national debt soars by 4 or 5% every single year. So in just 3 or 4 years' time, our debt relative to the size of the economy would go from 100% now to 120% in 3 or 4 years' time. This is serious. This will lead to a massive, massive crisis. In order to fund that, government borrowing rates would have to go up again, which would damage the economy further. You end up with a complete doom loop, a spiral. It's like heading towards an iceberg, hitting it, and tragically sinking. That is where we are going as an economy, as a country, and that's why I say, ladies and gentlemen, we have to change course. In conclusion, a debt crisis awaits us unless we dramatically cut the vast amount of wasteful government spending, unless we cut consumer taxes to reduce inflation and to create some growth. But I've shown how you actually pay for those tax cuts. I know lots of people say, well, we tried that and it doesn't work. It does work if you cut the wasteful government spending. That is the key. And it's all there to be saved. Ben's talked about how all of these other factors are impacting on costs, reducing growth, the wokery, the ESG, the EDI, net zero. All of this stuff is damaging our potential, it's reducing our prospects, it's lowering our growth. We've got to deregulate. That, of course, was one of the great Brexit opportunities that this government has utterly, totally failed to take advantage of. Ladies and gentlemen, we have to grow our way out of the crisis, otherwise we're going to hit the iceberg. Thank you very much indeed.